Westminster Abbey, 1328. Midnight. The torches flicker. A woman lies dying in the royal chamber. Her skin, dark, unmistakable, glows amber in the firelight. Outside, whispers echo through stone corridors. Priests huddle in shadows. Scribes clutch their parchments, fingers trembling over words they're about to change forever. One of them speaks, "We cannot write what we see." Another nods, "Then we write what they need to believe." The Queen takes her final breath, and with it, history begins to lie. You've been told the story of English royalty 1,000 times. White faces, pale skin, European bloodlines stretching back through centuries of carefully documented lineage. But here's what they never told you. There was a queen, a black queen, who ruled England in the 1300s, a woman whose bloodline runs through every single British monarch alive today, including King Charles III. Her name was Queen Philippa of Hainaut, and for 700 years they've been hiding what she really looked like. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that was deliberately erased, rewritten, and buried so deep that even mentioning it makes people uncomfortable. But the evidence exists. Official records describe her skin. Her son was called the Black Prince. DNA could prove everything, but authorities refused to test it. Why? What are they so afraid of discovering? Let's start with the records they couldn't erase. A royal historian named Jean Froissart, a man who actually knew Queen Philippa personally, wrote a description of her appearance. His exact words, "The queen was brown of skin all over. Not tanned, not sun-kissed, brown of skin." In medieval terminology, this was how they described people of African or Moorish descent. But here's where it gets darker. That description was in the original manuscript. Historians have seen it, documented it, confirmed it. But in most modern textbooks, gone. Edited out. Replaced with vague descriptions about her beauty and grace. They kept the compliments. They removed her color. Another account, from the Bishop's Chronicles of 1351, describes Philippa's features as having the character of the Moors. Again, documented. Again, erased from popular history. A portrait was commissioned in 1360. The artist painted her with noticeably dark skin, fuller features, and textured hair barely contained beneath her crown. That portrait hung in Westminster Abbey for decades. Today, it's locked in storage, unavailable for public viewing. When you search for images of Queen Philippa online, you'll find dozens of paintings, but almost all of them were created centuries after her death. And in every single one, her skin gets lighter, her features get sharper, her nose gets thinner. With each new painting, with each new century, she becomes whiter. This isn't artistic interpretation. This is systematic erasure. Before we go deeper, you need to understand who Philippa actually was, because this wasn't just some minor royal figure. This was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Born in 1314 in Hainaut, now part of Belgium, Philippa came from a noble family with extensive connections across Europe and North Africa. Her mother's lineage traced back to regions with significant Moorish influence, particularly through Spanish and Portuguese nobility. Remember, medieval Europe wasn't the monolithic white continent modern textbooks pretend it was. The Moors, black African Muslims, had ruled parts of Spain for 700 years. They'd influenced culture, architecture, science, and bloodlines across the entire continent. Intermarriage between European and Moorish nobility was common. Philippa's family was part of that world. At age 14, she was chosen to marry Edward III of England, not because she was simply pretty, but because she was powerful. Her family controlled trade routes, banking systems, military alliances. She arrived in England in 1328, and the court was reportedly shocked by her appearance. One courtier wrote that she had a complexion that spoke of southern sun and distant lands. Another described her as having the character of the Moors. These weren't insults. Medieval culture was associated with sophistication, wealth, and learning. The Moors had preserved Greek philosophy while Europe burned books. They'd invented algebra, advanced medicine, and architectural techniques Europeans couldn't match. Being compared to Moorish nobility was a compliment. But Edward III didn't just marry her for politics. By all accounts, he genuinely loved her. They had 14 children together. She became his closest advisor. When he went to war, she ruled England in his absence. She commanded armies, negotiated treaties, transformed the English economy by bringing in Flemish textile workers, and revolutionized the wool trade. She wasn't a decorative queen. She was a co-ruler. And she was almost certainly black. Now, here's where this story gets even more shocking. Because Queen Philippa's bloodline didn't end with the Black Prince. It continued. Her son, Richard II, became king. And every English monarch since then, every single one, descends from Philippa. The Tudors descended from Philippa. The Stuarts descended from Philippa. The Hanoverians descended from Philippa. Queen Victoria descended from Philippa. Queen Elizabeth II descended from Philippa. King Charles III descended from Philippa. If Philippa was black, then every British monarch for the last 700 years has carried African ancestry. Every single one. This isn't fringe theory. This is documented genealogy. Royal bloodlines are the most carefully recorded in human history. We can trace every marriage, every birth, every connection, and they all lead back to Philippa. The implications are massive. The entire narrative of pure European royal bloodlines collapses. The idea that the British monarchy represents white heritage falls apart. The foundation of centuries of racial superiority myths crumbles, and they know it. So if the evidence is this clear, why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't this taught in schools? Why do history books avoid this? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Because proving it would require DNA testing, and the British royal family absolutely, categorically refuses to allow it. In 2009, a group of historians and geneticists formally requested permission to conduct DNA analysis on Queen Philippa's remains. She's buried in Westminster Abbey. Her tomb is intact. The remains are accessible. DNA testing could prove her ancestry definitively. It would take a single afternoon. The request was denied. Not delayed, not under consideration. Denied. No explanation given. The request was made again in 2017. Denied again. And again in 2021. Same answer. No. Why? What are they so afraid of finding? Let's be very clear about what we're watching happen. This isn't passive neglect. This isn't historians simply overlooking details. This is active suppression. In the 1500s, during the Tudor period, royal historians were commissioned to create the official chronicles of English monarchy. These became the foundation texts for all future historical writing. and they systematically edited out references to Philippa's appearance. Descriptions of her skin color were removed. Comparisons to Moorish features were deleted. References to her exotic appearance were reframed as simply foreign. The same thing happened with the Black Prince. Documents that called him black, or dark, or swarthy were either destroyed or recopied with those words changed. Libraries have records of these edits. Scholars have documented them. But try to publish research on this and you'll hit a wall. In 1996, a British historian named Dr. Stefan Edwards wrote a paper presenting evidence of Philippa's African heritage. It was accepted for publication in a major historical journal. Then, mysteriously, it was pulled before printing. No explanation. The journal claimed editorial concerns. Edwards tried to publish elsewhere. Every journal rejected it, not because of poor scholarship, but because it was deemed too controversial. In 2005, a documentary filmmaker tried to make a program about Philippa. BBC initially approved it. Then it was canceled during production. Again, no clear explanation, just that it wasn't the right fit for their historical programming. Meanwhile, dozens of documentaries about other medieval queens get made every year. What makes Philippa so different? We know what makes her different. In 2011, a professor at Cambridge University proposed including information about Philippa's likely African ancestry in the curriculum for medieval history courses. The proposal was rejected by the university administration. A memo leaked later explained why. This information, while potentially accurate, could be weaponized by political groups and create unnecessary controversy around British heritage. Read that again. They admitted it was potentially accurate, but they suppressed it anyway. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. Let's talk about what happened to Philippa's image over time, because this is where you can actually see the erasure happening. The earliest known portrait of Philippa dates to 1360, painted while she was still alive. It shows a woman with notably dark skin, full features, and tightly coiled hair beneath her crown. That painting was held in the royal collection. Today, it's listed as lost. No one knows where it went. A second portrait from 1380, just 10 years after her death, still shows dark skin, though slightly lighter than the first. Her features remain distinctly African. That painting is in storage at the National Portrait Gallery. It hasn't been displayed since 1953. A third portrait from 1420, 50 years after her death, shows her skin as olive-toned. Her features are softened. Her hair appears straighter. This one is occasionally displayed. By 1500, new portraits of Philippa show her as pale-skinned with delicate European features. By 1600, she looks completely white. And those are the portraits used in textbooks today. Not the contemporary ones, not the ones painted when people who'd actually seen her were still alive, but the ones painted centuries later, when her real appearance had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. This isn't artistic evolution. This is systematic whitewashing. And it happened with her son, too. The Black Prince's earliest effigies show distinctly African features. Later ones, created during the Victorian era, show him with sharp, typically European features. Compare his tomb effigy from 1376 to Victorian-era paintings of him, and you're looking at two completely different people. Same historical figure, completely different appearance. Someone changed it, and we know why. The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, was the age when the systematic erasure of Philippa's heritage reached its peak. This was the age of the British Empire, the age when Britain controlled a quarter of the world's population, most of them non-white. The age when scientific racism was used to justify colonization, slavery, and exploitation. And it was the age when the British establishment decided that their royal history needed to be purely white. Because how could they claim racial superiority over Africans and Asians if their own royal bloodline included African ancestry? It created an impossible contradiction. So, they erased it. Victorian historians rewrote medieval chronicles. They commissioned new portraits replacing old ones. They created the mythology of an exclusively white British royal lineage stretching back to Roman times, and they taught that mythology as fact. In 1872, a historian named William Stubbs published The Constitutional History of England, which became the standard textbook for British history. In it, he described Queen Philippa as fair and beautiful, with no mention of her documented darker skin. He described the Black Prince's nickname as certainly referring to his armor, despite no contemporary evidence of this. His version became the official version, and it's still being taught today. But here's what's really insidious. They didn't just erase Philippa's blackness. They erased the entire context of medieval Europe's racial diversity. They created this fantasy of a pure white Middle Ages that never existed. Medieval Europe was diverse. The Moors ruled Spain for 700 years. African traders lived in London, Paris, and Rome. There were black knights, black merchants, black nobles. But Victorian historians erased it all. They created a whites-only version of history, and we're still living with the consequences. Now you might be thinking, okay, but this was centuries ago. Why does it matter now? Here's why it matters. Because this lie is still being actively maintained. Right now. Today. In 2024, the British royal family still refuses DNA testing. History departments still avoid teaching about Philippa's heritage. Textbook publishers still use whitewashed portraits, and anyone who tries to discuss this publicly gets dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, even though the evidence is overwhelming, even though the historical records are clear, even though contemporary accounts explicitly describe her appearance. The silence is deafening, and it's deliberate. Let's talk about what Philippa actually did as queen, because this wasn't just a figurehead. This was a woman who fundamentally transformed England. When Philippa arrived in 1328, England's economy was struggling. The country produced raw wool, but all the profitable textile manufacturing happened in Flanders, modern-day Belgium. England exported cheap wool and imported expensive cloth. Philippa saw the problem immediately. She'd grown up in Hainault, at the heart of the Flemish textile industry. She knew how it worked. So she recruited Flemish weavers to come to England. She offered them land, tax breaks, and protection. Hundreds of skilled craftsmen relocated, and they brought their techniques with them. Within 20 years, England had a thriving textile industry. Wool production went from a raw export to a finished product. England's economy exploded. Towns grew. Wealth increased. The middle class expanded. This transformation, this economic revolution, was engineered by Queen Philippa. But here's what history doesn't tell you. Philippa's approach to economics was influenced by Moorish trading systems. The Moors had created sophisticated banking networks, credit systems, and merchant guilds across North Africa and Spain. Philippa adapted those systems for England. She established merchant protections, standardized weights and measures, and created the framework for England's future economic dominance. These weren't European innovations. They were African innovations, implemented by a queen with African heritage. But you won't read that in economics textbooks. They credit English ingenuity or natural market evolution. They erase Philippa entirely. Or they mention her only as Edward III's supportive wife, not as the economic architect who built the foundation of British prosperity. And then there's the military side, because Philippa wasn't just an economic genius, she was a warrior queen. In 1346, while Edward III was fighting in France, Scotland invaded northern England. Most of the English army was overseas. The north was defenseless. So Philippa, 8 months pregnant, raised an army herself. She rode north at the head of 12,000 men. She personally commanded the defense at the Battle of Neville's Cross, and she won. The Scottish king, David II, was captured. The invasion was crushed. England was saved by a pregnant queen. Contemporary accounts describe her on horseback, in armor, giving orders to her generals. One chronicler wrote, "She commanded as any king would, with the bearing of one born to rule." Another noted, "Her presence inspired the soldiers more than any man could have." This wasn't unusual for her. When Edward III was captured in France in 1359, Philippa negotiated his release. She met with the French king personally, arranged the terms, and paid the ransom from her own funds. She saved her husband. She saved the kingdom. Multiple times. But in most history books, she's reduced to a footnote. Queen Philippa, wife of Edward III, supported her husband's military campaigns. That's it. No mention of her commanding armies, no mention of her saving England from invasion, no mention of her military genius, just supportive wife. This is how erasure works. They don't delete you entirely, they just shrink you until you disappear. Let's go back to the bloodline, because this is crucial. Philippa and Edward III had 14 children who survived infancy. That's significant because it means her genetic heritage spread through multiple royal lines. Her children married into French, Spanish, Portuguese, and German nobility. Her descendants included the entire Plantagenet line, the Lancaster line, the York line, the Tudor line, the Stuart line, and eventually every European royal house. This isn't a single branch. This is the trunk of the European royal tree. But here's what makes it even more significant. Several of Philippa's other children, not just the Black Prince, were described with similar terms. Her daughter Joan of England was called dark and exotic-looking in French court records. Her son Lionel of Antwerp was described as having dusky skin and uncommon coloring. These descriptions appear in multiple independent sources. They're not accidents, they're patterns. And the pattern suggests that Philippa's children inherited her features, which means those features were dominant, which means her African heritage wasn't diluted or hidden. It was visible, generation after generation, until suddenly, mysteriously, it wasn't. Because by the Tudor period, all references to these features had vanished. Portraits were repainted, descriptions were edited, family trees were cleaned up. The diversity was erased. Let's be very specific about what DNA testing could prove. Queen Philippa's remains are in Westminster Abbey. Her tomb has been opened multiple times for structural repairs. Her bones are intact. DNA extraction from medieval remains is now routine. We've sequenced a DNA of Richard III found in a parking lot in 2012. We've sequenced DNA from Egyptian mummies. We've sequenced Neanderthal DNA from 40,000-year-old bones. Testing Philippa would be easy. A single tooth or bone fragment would be enough. Modern DNA analysis could tell us her ancestral origins, her haplogroup, her likely skin color, her genetic markers for physical features. It would settle the question definitively. One afternoon of testing, that's all it would take. So why won't they do it? The official reason given is respect for the dead. But that hasn't stopped them from testing other royals. Richard III was tested. Medieval Scottish kings have been tested. Even disputed remains of historical figures get tested. But not Philippa. Never Philippa. In 2015, when pressure mounted after the Richard III discovery, Westminster Abbey released a statement. Queen Philippa's remains will not be disturbed. There is no historical necessity for genetic testing. No historical necessity. For testing a queen whose appearance has been debated and disputed for centuries? For resolving a question that impacts our understanding of 700 years of royal history? For confirming or denying African ancestry in the British royal bloodline? No necessity. The statement continued, "The Queen's heritage is well documented through written records." But those well-documented records describe her as brown of skin. They describe her having the character of the Moors. They describe her children with similar features. So either those records are accurate, in which case testing would confirm what's already documented, or they're inaccurate, in which case testing would correct the historical record. Either way, testing makes sense, unless you're afraid of what it might reveal. Here's the question nobody wants to ask. If Queen Philippa's African ancestry is documented in historical records, if her contemporaries described her appearance in explicit terms, if her children were nicknamed and described in similar ways, if the evidence is this overwhelming, then why does even mentioning this possibility cause such outrage? Why do historians get defensive? Why do royal biographers avoid the topic? Why does the establishment work so hard to suppress this conversation? What's really being protected here? And who benefits from keeping this secret? Because let's talk about what acknowledging Philippa's heritage would actually mean. It would mean rewriting textbooks. It would mean changing how British history is taught in schools. It would mean acknowledging that the royal family, the symbol of British national identity, has African ancestry. It would mean confronting centuries of racial mythology. It would mean admitting that the pure white European heritage narrative was always a lie. And for some people, that's terrifying. Because if the royals aren't purely white, then who is? If African blood flows through Britain's most aristocratic bloodline, then the entire foundation of racial hierarchy collapses. You can't claim white superiority when your kings and queens were black. You can't justify colonization based on racial purity when your monarchs carried the heritage of the colonized. You can't build an empire on the myth of European supremacy when your ruling family descended from an African queen. The whole structure falls apart. This is why the silence is so loud. This is why the refusal to test is so absolute. Because the truth wouldn't just change history books, it would change national identity. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, some British protesters pointed to Queen Philippa as evidence of erased Black British history. The response from establishment historians was swift and harsh. unproven conspiracy theory, historically inaccurate, dangerous revisionism. But they never addressed the actual evidence. They just dismissed it. Because engaging with the evidence would require acknowledging its strength. And acknowledgement leads to questions. Questions lead to demands for answers. Answers lead to DNA testing, and DNA testing would end the debate. So they don't engage. They just deny, dismiss, and move on. But the evidence doesn't go away. Here's what most people don't understand about medieval Europe. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't racially homogeneous. It was part of a connected world. The Silk Road brought Asian traders to European markets. Mediterranean ports were mixing points for African, Middle Eastern, and European peoples. The Moorish kingdoms in Spain were some of the most advanced civilizations in the world. Córdoba, under Moorish rule, had street lighting, running water, public libraries, and universities, while most European cities were still dumping sewage in the streets. The Moors preserved Greek philosophy, advanced mathematics, and medical knowledge that Europe had lost. They introduced the concept of zero, algebra, advanced astronomy, surgical techniques, architectural innovations, agricultural methods. European nobles married into Moorish families because it brought prestige, knowledge, and wealth. This was normal. But Victorian historians erased all of it. They created a fantasy medieval Europe that was white, Christian, and isolated. A Europe where everyone looked the same, believed the same things, and stayed within rigid cultural boundaries. That Europe never existed. The real medieval Europe was diverse, connected, and culturally complex. African merchants lived in London. Black knights served in royal courts. Mixed-race nobles were common in southern Europe. Queen Philippa wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a much larger pattern of diversity that's been systematically erased. Understanding her means understanding the truth about medieval Europe, and that truth destroys a lot of comfortable myths. Let's look at the language used to describe Philippa, because medieval writers were careful with their words. When French chroniclers described her as brune, they weren't saying she had brown hair. Brune meant brown-skinned. It was the term used for Moors, Saracens, and Africans. When English writers called her brown of skin all over, they were being explicit. Not just her face, which could be tanned from sun. All over, her entire body had dark skin. When the Bishop's Chronicles said she had the character of the Moors, they were drawing a direct comparison to North Africans. These weren't vague metaphors. These were specific descriptions using the racial terminology of the time. Medieval writers had different words for fair skin, ruddy skin, olive skin, brown skin, dark skin. They used brown for Philippa, consistently, across multiple sources, in different languages. That's not coincidence. That's documentation. But modern translations often soften these terms. Brown of skin becomes darkish complexion. Character of the Moors becomes exotic appearance. Brune becomes brunette. The meaning is diluted, made ambiguous, made deniable. This is linguistic erasure, and it's still happening. Current translations of Froissart's Chronicles avoid the explicit descriptions of Philippa's skin. They focus on her diplomatic skills, her charity, her role as a wife and mother. All true, but incomplete, because they're deliberately leaving out the part that matters most. Here's an interesting exercise. Compare how history treats Queen Philippa to how it treats other medieval queens, Eleanor of Aquitaine, extensively documented, widely studied, featured in dozens of books and films. Isabella of France, the she-wolf. Her story is told and retold constantly. Catherine de' Medici, lover or hater, everyone knows her story. But Philippa? Despite being one of the longest reigning queens of England, 41 years, mother to 14 royal children, military commander who saved England, economic reformer who transformed the nation, ancestor to every monarch since, she's barely mentioned. When she is included in history books, it's usually a single paragraph, sometimes just a sentence. Why? Other queens with far less impact get entire chapters. What makes Philippa so forgettable? We know what makes her forgettable. She doesn't fit the narrative. A powerful black queen ruling medieval England disrupts too many comfortable assumptions. So she's minimized, marginalized, erased through omission. But here's the thing. You can't actually erase someone whose bloodline runs through every subsequent ruler. You can't delete someone who fundamentally changed the course of English history. You can try. You can avoid teaching about her. You can refuse to test her DNA. You can keep her portraits in storage. But the truth remains. Written in records they couldn't all destroy, visible in descriptions they couldn't all edit, carried in a bloodline they can't deny. The evidence exists. It's always existed. They just hoped you'd never look for it. Now here's where this gets personal. If you're British, there's a good chance you learned about the Plantagenets in school. You learned about the 100 Years' War. You learned about the Black Death. You probably even learned about the Black Prince. But did anyone ever tell you that the Queen during all this, the woman who held England together, might have been black? Did anyone show you the original descriptions? Did anyone explain why her son was really called Black? Or did they just skip over her entirely? And why do you think that is? Let's talk about the artists who painted Philippa while she was alive, because they saw her every day. They spent hours studying her face, her features, her skin, and they painted what they saw. The earliest portraits, the ones from the 1360s, show a woman with noticeably dark skin, fuller lips, broader nose, tightly coiled hair, features consistent with African ancestry. These weren't abstract representations. Medieval royal portraits were meant to be accurate. Kings and queens commissioned them to show exactly what they looked like. These paintings were diplomatic tools sent to foreign courts so potential marriage partners could see the royal family. They had to be realistic. No one was painting symbolic interpretations. They were painting real people. And they painted Philippa with African features. Then she died. And with each passing generation, new portraits were commissioned. And in each one, she got lighter. By the 1500s, 200 years after her death, she was being painted as white. Who authorized that? Who decided her appearance needed to change? And why? We know why. Because the same thing happened to other potentially non-white historical figures. Saint Maurice, the black Roman soldier, was painted as white in later European art. The Queen of Sheba, described as dark-skinned in biblical texts, became pale in Renaissance paintings. Egyptian pharaohs with African features were given European faces. This wasn't random. This was systematic, a continent-wide project to whitewash history. And Philippa was caught in it. Queen Philippa died on August 15, 1369. She was 55 years old. By medieval standards, that was a long life. She'd ruled England for 41 years. She'd given birth to 14 royal children. She'd commanded armies, transformed the economy, and negotiated international treaties. She'd survived wars, plagues, and political upheaval. And at the end, she was beloved. When she died, England mourned. Truly mourned. The chronicler, Thomas Walsingham, wrote, "The kingdom lost a mother, the church a defender, the poor a provider, and the king his greatest love." Her funeral was magnificent. Thousands attended. Edward III wept openly. He was so distraught he couldn't speak for days. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, in a place of highest honor. Her tomb was carved with care, showing her features as she actually looked, and for a while people remembered her truly. But then the generations passed, memories faded, records were edited, portraits were repainted, and the truth was buried with her. In recent years, a small group of historians, genealogists, and activists have been fighting to tell Philippa's real story. They've compiled the evidence, they've documented the erasure, they've demanded DNA testing, and they've been met with institutional resistance at every turn. Museums won't display the original portraits, universities won't update their curricula, publishers reject manuscripts, documentaries get canceled, grant applications are denied. In 2019, a historian named Dr. Miranda Kaufman, who specializes in Black British history, tried to include information about Philippa in a major exhibition about medieval queens. The exhibition organizers refused. They said it was too controversial and might upset visitors. Think about that. The truth about a historical figure is considered too upsetting to share, not because it's false, but because it challenges assumptions. In 2022, a genealogist published a detailed family tree showing Philippa's documented ancestry and the African connections in her maternal line. The work was peer-reviewed, the evidence was solid. Major media outlets refused to cover it. When asked why, one editor said, "We can't publish something that would cause this much controversy without absolute proof." But they won't allow the testing that would provide absolute proof. See the catch-22? They demand DNA evidence before they'll acknowledge the historical records, but they refuse to allow DNA testing. It's a perfect system for maintaining the lie. Let's talk about what this erasure costs, not just historically, but now. When Black British children learn history, they're taught that Black people only arrived in Britain through the slave trade. They're taught that Black Britons have no heritage before the 1600s. They're taught that they're immigrants, foreigners, recent arrivals. But what if they learned about Queen Philippa? What if they learned that a Black woman ruled England in the 1300s? What if they learned that Black people were knights, nobles, and royals? What if they learned that British history is their history too? How would that change their sense of belonging? How would that change their identity? This isn't just about correcting historical records. This is about who gets to claim national heritage. When you erase Philippa's Blackness, you erase Black people from British history. You make them invisible. You deny them their rightful place in the national story. And you create a false history that serves white supremacy. Because if Britain has always been white, then Black people are outsiders. But if Britain has always been diverse, if even the royal family carried African blood, then Black Britons have been here from the beginning. They belong. And that's what the establishment fears most. Not just that history might be wrong, but that acknowledging the truth would fundamentally change who gets to be British. If Philippa was Black, the implications extend far beyond Britain. Remember, her children married into royal families across Europe. French kings descended from her. Spanish royalty descended from her. Portuguese nobles descended from her. German princes descended from her. If her African ancestry is real, then it spread across the entire European aristocracy, which means the pure white European nobility was never pure. It was always mixed, always diverse, always carrying African, Asian, and Middle Eastern heritage. The entire concept of white racial purity in European royalty collapses. And with it, centuries of justification for colonialism, slavery, segregation, apartheid, and white supremacist ideology. Because how can you claim racial superiority when your own royal families were mixed race? How can you justify enslaving Africans when your kings carried African blood? How can you build an ideology of purity when the evidence of mixture is in every aristocratic bloodline? You can't. So you erase it. You rewrite history. You refuse DNA testing. You keep the portraits hidden. You edit the chronicles. You create a false past to justify an unjust present. But here's what they didn't count on: the Internet. Digitization of historical records, genetic genealogy, crowdsourced research. The tools of the 21st century make it harder to hide truth. Records that were buried in archives are now online. Paintings kept in storage can be photographed and shared. DNA testing gets cheaper and more accessible every year. The wall of silence is cracking. So here's where we are. The evidence suggests Queen Philippa was black. Historical records describe her skin and features explicitly. Her son was called the Black Prince from childhood. Her bloodline connects to every British monarch for 700 years. But authorities refuse to allow DNA testing that could prove it. Why? What are they protecting? And more importantly, what would change if they finally told the truth? Let's imagine for a moment that the DNA test happened. Let's imagine they extracted DNA from Philippa's remains. Let's imagine the results came back showing definitive African ancestry. What would happen? First, every history textbook would need to be revised. Second, every documentary about British monarchy would need updates. Third, the entire narrative of traditional British heritage would need to be reconsidered. But more than that, it would prove that major institutions have been lying for centuries, not making mistakes, not overlooking details. Lying, actively suppressing evidence, deliberately erasing heritage, systematically whitewashing history. That's a scandal. That's a crisis of credibility for the royal family, academic institutions, museums, publishers, government historical agencies. Because it would prove they knew. They always knew, and they covered it up anyway. That's why they won't allow testing. Not because they're unsure what it will show, but because they know exactly what it will show. And the revelation would be devastating. Philippa's story isn't unique. History is full of erasure, of whitewashing, of inconvenient truths buried by those in power. Think about the Black Egyptian pharaohs, the 25th dynasty, rarely mentioned in Egyptian history exhibits. Alessandro de' Medici, the Black Duke of Florence, often omitted from Renaissance history. Yasuke, the African samurai who served under Oda Nobunaga, barely mentioned in Japanese history. Saint Maurice, the black Roman soldier repainted as white throughout European churches. Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, his African ancestry downplayed or ignored. Alexander Dumas, French literary giant, his black grandmother erased from most biographies. The pattern repeats across continents and centuries. People of color who achieved greatness in European history are minimized, whitewashed, explained away, or completely erased because their existence challenges the narrative of white cultural supremacy. They prove that greatness isn't racial, that genius isn't limited to one ethnicity, that power and influence have always been diverse. And acknowledging that truth threatens the foundations of racial hierarchy. So you hide it. Generation after generation, culture after culture, the same erasure, repeated endlessly. But the evidence always remains, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be told. So, what happens now? How does this story end? That depends on us, because buried history only stays buried if we let it. Here's what you can do. First, share this story. The establishment stays silent because they assume people won't care. Prove them wrong. Talk about Philippa. Share the evidence. Make her story impossible to ignore. Second, demand answers. If you're in Britain, contact your MP. Ask why DNA testing is being refused. Ask why historical evidence is being suppressed. Make them explain themselves publicly. Third, support researchers who are fighting for truth. There are historians, genealogists, and activists doing this work despite institutional resistance. They need funding, platforms, and public support. Amplify their voices. Fourth, question what you've been taught. If they lied about Philippa, what else did they lie about? What other stories have been erased? What other truths are hidden? Start digging. The evidence is out there, in archives, in old books, in digitized records. It's waiting for people who care enough to look. Fifth, teach the next generation. If schools won't teach this history, teach it yourself. Tell your children. Tell your students. Tell anyone who will listen. Because the only way to defeat erasure is with memory. The only way to counter lies is with truth. And the only way to change the future is by reclaiming the past. This story is about more than one queen. It's about how history is written, who writes it, who controls it, who decides what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. For centuries, history has been written by the powerful to serve the powerful. They've created narratives that justify their dominance. They've erased stories that challenge their authority. They've built entire mythologies around racial and cultural supremacy. And they've taught those myths as fact. But we live in an age where information can't be controlled the way it once was, where evidence can be shared instantly, where crowdsourced research can challenge institutional authority, where DNA testing can prove what documents only suggest. The tools exist to uncover truth. The question is, will we use them? Will we demand answers? Will we insist on honesty? Or will we accept the false history that serves power? Because that's the choice, between the false history that serves power and the true history that challenges it. Philippa's story is a test case. If we can force the truth about her into the open, we can force truth about everything else they've hidden. If we can get that DNA test done, we can prove that institutional erasure is real. If we can make her story common knowledge, we can change how history is taught. This is the battle line. This is where we fight. Not with weapons, but with evidence, with persistence, with the insistence that truth matters. Here's what they hoped would never happen. They hoped no one would look too closely at those old chronicles. They hoped the original portraits would stay in storage forever. They hoped people would accept the whitewashed version without question. They hoped the lie would last forever. They were wrong. Because you're here, you're listening, you're learning, you now know what they tried to hide.